Before open-world RPGs became a standard feature of the industry, there were a handful of pioneers quietly laying the groundwork. These weren't always polished, and sometimes they were deeply flawed, but they dared to imagine worlds bigger, stranger, and more reactive than most players thought possible at the time. If you want to talk about open-world RPGs being ahead of their time, you almost have to start with Ultima VII: The Black Gate. Released in 1992, it wasn't just ambitious. It was a game that redefined what a living world could look like on a computer screen. Most RPGs back then gave you combat, stats, and a story to follow. This gave you all that, but layered it into a simulationist sandbox that still feels shockingly modern. Britannia wasn't just a backdrop for quests, it was a functioning ecosystem. NPCs followed daily schedules, baked bread, farmed, drank at taverns, and reacted to you in ways that felt human. You could loot houses, cook food, craft items, or simply wander around and watch the world go on without you. It was the kind of interactivity that we associate with games like The Elder Scrolls or maybe The Witcher, but Ultima was doing it decades earlier. What made it stand out was the way these systems tied into the darker narrative. On the surface, Britannia felt peaceful, with the rise of the Fellowship, a benevolent-seeming group preaching unity and harmony. But as you dug deeper, the cracks showed. Ritual murders, conspiracies, and manipulation bubbled under the surface. The fact that the world felt so alive made uncovering these sinister elements even more powerful. Of course, by today's standards, the game is rough. The UI is clunky, combat is more of a nuisance than a highlight, and getting it to run smoothly on modern systems often requires fan patches. But these flaws don't erase how groundbreaking it was. It wasn't just telling a story. It was immersing us in a society, one that reacted to your presence and made us feel like part of a larger system. You can trace a straight line from Ultima VII to nearly every major open-world RPG of the last 30 years. Bethesda, BioWare, CD Projekt Red, all of them owe a debt to its vision. It may look dated now, but in 1992, it was nothing short of revolutionary. While most open-world RPGs of the early 2000s were obsessed with sprawling landscapes and massive overworlds, Arx Vitalis did the exact opposite. This cult classic trapped players underground in a sprawling, subterranean kingdom. Instead of forests, mountains, and open skies, you explored twisting caverns, ruined fortresses, and settlements carved deep into stone. It wasn't a traditional open world in the sense of scale, but it was revolutionary in how reactive and immersive its spaces were. The game stood out for its unique approach to magic. Instead of simply clicking to cast a spell, you had to draw rune symbols with your mouse in real time. It was clunky, sure, but also deeply engaging. Messing up a gesture mid-battle could cost you dearly, but pulling off the perfect incantation felt incredibly rewarding. It was a system that demanded focus and mastery, a kind of tactile immersion that most RPGs avoided. What really set it apart was its immersive sim DNA. NPCs had routines, environments were interactive, and quests often had multiple solutions. You could sneak past enemies, manipulate systems, or just brute force your way through encounters. It wasn't just about checking off quest markers. It was about experimenting within a world that seemed to recognize and respond to your actions. This design philosophy would later become Arcane's signature style. Of course, the game wasn't perfect. Its combat was clunky, the interface wasn't exactly user-friendly, and the story was pretty standard dark fantasy fare. On top of that, its underground setting sometimes felt monotonous, lacking the visual variety of more traditional RPGs. But these flaws couldn't overshadow just how forward-thinking it was. At a time when open world usually meant big maps with repetitive quests, Arx Vitalis offered a dense, reactive playground that valued depth over sheer size.
More exciting than it sounds.
Back in 2004, when most action RPGs were trying and usually failing to chase Diablo 2, Sacred quietly carved out its own space in the genre. On the surface, it looked like yet another isometric hack and slash. But once you dug in, you realized this game was doing something very different. Instead of a small, instanced map with repeated runs, Sacred dropped players into a massive, seamless open world filled with towns, forests, deserts, swamps, and snowy mountains, all explorable without load screens. That was almost unheard of at the time for an ARPG. The sheer scope of Ancaria, the game's setting, was a big part of what made it feel so special. There are dozens of side quests, hidden dungeons, and quirky NPC encounters that made exploration worthwhile. Unlike other games that kept you locked into a grind-heavy loop, Sacred rewarded wandering. You could stumble across bandit hideouts, dragon battles, or odd little side stories that had nothing to do with the main quest. It gave the game a sense of life and unpredictability that made it stand out in a crowded field. That said, it wasn't perfect. The balance was all over the place. Some characters felt absurdly overpowered, while others struggled in later stages. The online multiplayer was ambitious, but it often ran into stability problems. And let's be honest, the visuals and animations looked dated even at launch, especially compared to Diablo 2. But it still offered something fresh. Its open-world design laid the groundwork for future ARPGs to think bigger, proving the genre didn't have to be confined to claustrophobic dungeons. In some ways, you could argue that games like Path of Exile or even Diablo 4 owe a debt to this game for showing that scale and exploration could live alongside loot-driven action. Today, it doesn't get talked about much, but among fans of classic PC RPGs, Sacred is an ambitious but slightly messy gem. It might not have toppled Diablo, but it showed there was another way forward.
I need someone to go there.
If there's one game that embodies the phrase ahead of its time, but painfully clumsy, it's Two Worlds. It arrived during the same period as Oblivion, which meant comparisons were inevitable and not often favorable. Critics hammered it for its awkward animations, laughable dialogue, and uneven presentation. But underneath all that jank was a surprisingly ambitious open-world RPG that gave players an impressive amount of freedom. The world of Annalore was vast, filled with dungeons, sprawling towns, and dangerous wilderness. Unlike many others, it didn't try to funnel players down a neat main quest line. Instead, it embraced a free-form approach, letting you wander wherever curiosity pulled you. You could stumble into high-level areas way too early, get flattened by a monster you weren't ready for, and learn the hard way that the game wasn't going to scale everything to your level. It was punishing, yes, but it also gave the world a sense of danger and discovery that more polished RPGs sometimes lacked. One of the most interesting aspects was its flexibility in character progression. You weren't locked into rigid classes. You could mix and match skills as you pleased, crafting hybrid builds that felt uniquely yours. The loot system was equally experimental, letting you combine duplicate weapons to strengthen them, creating a kind of proto-crafting mechanic that felt inventive at the time. Of course, the flaws are impossible to ignore. The writing often veered into unintentionally hilarious territory, with archaic dialogue that quickly became a meme. Combat felt clunky and unrefined, and the technical performance on both PC and console left much to be desired. But despite all that, Two Worlds carved out a niche audience that appreciated its ambition. It wasn't trying to be smooth or cinematic. It was trying to be expansive, weird, and unpredictable. In its own way, that freedom made it more open world than some of its more successful peers. When people talk about massive open worlds, they used to think of Skyrim and now Elden Ring, though they have become a dime a dozen. Back in 1996, Daggerfall was already redefining scale in ways that still seem almost absurd today. Its map covered an estimated 161,000 square kilometers. That's bigger than some real countries, packed with towns, villages, dungeons, and wilderness to explore. Even though much of it was procedurally generated, the sheer scope was jaw-dropping, and it made players feel like they were stepping into a fantasy continent that stretched far beyond their reach. Unlike its predecessor, it didn't just rely on size. It introduced a complex character creation system with custom classes, reputations, and guilds that made every playthrough feel personal. You could pledge allegiance to different factions, take on random quests, or simply wander the land looking for adventure. While modern RPGs often boast about choice and consequence, Daggerfall was already experimenting with the idea decades earlier, letting you live as a knight, thief, mage, or even dabble in darker paths like vampirism and lycanthropy. That ambition came with trade-offs. The procedural generation meant many dungeons and towns felt repetitive, and the bugs were infamous. Getting stuck in geometry or dealing with broken quest lines was just part of the experience. The game was so unwieldy that even hardcore fans admit it's more enjoyable with fan-made fixes and mods than it ever was at launch. But at the same time, those flaws didn't stop players from being awed by the sense of freedom. What Daggerfall proved was that open-world RPGs didn't have to be tightly scripted experiences. They could be sprawling sandboxes where systems and scale gave rise to emergent stories. Today's Bethesda titles still carry that DNA. The freedom to wander, to roleplay in ways the developers couldn't fully predict, to get lost in a world too big to fully control.
He is the representative of the
While some open-world RPGs impressed with sheer size, Gothic 2 proved that density and reactivity could matter just as much, if not more. It didn't have the sprawling landmass of Daggerfall, but what it offered was a handcrafted world that felt alive in a way few games managed at the time. Every valley, farm, and castle seemed to serve a purpose, and every NPC had a routine that made the world feel like more than just a backdrop. What set this apart was how reactive it was. NPCs didn't just stand around waiting for you. They noticed your actions. Walk into someone's house uninvited and you'd get shouted at. Draw a weapon in town, and guards might warn you to put away. Push your luck too far, and you'd quickly learn that the world didn't revolve around your character. This wasn't a game that coddled the player. It expected you to respect its rules and earn your place within it. That difficulty extended into the gameplay. The opening hours were notoriously harsh, with tough enemies lurking just outside the starting area and combat that demanded timing and patience. Many players bounced off it because it felt unwelcoming compared to more known RPGs of the era. But that harshness made victory sweeter. Every skill gained, every new faction joined, and every hard-fought quest felt like you'd earned it through persistence rather than being handed a reward. The story itself wasn't revolutionary. A nameless hero navigating political intrigue, warring factions, and supernatural threats. But the way the world reinforced that narrative made it special. Whether you joined the militia, sided with mercenaries, or studied magic, your role in the world genuinely changed how others treated you. It felt personal in a way few RPGs did at the time. Gothic 2 was clunky, the controls awkward, and the learning curve brutal. But it dared to give players a world that wasn't built around them. And that bold design choice is why it still has such a dedicated cult following today.
You have access to the upper quarter, nothing more.
When at last the smoke cleared.
When people talk about overlooked late 90s RPGs, Drakan Order of the Flame almost always comes up. It combined third-person swordplay with something far more ambitious. Full 3D dragon flight across an interconnected open world. While most RPGs at the time kept exploration grounded and relatively linear, it gave players two perspectives: on foot with melee combat and puzzles, and soaring through the skies with your dragon companion. That blend of grounded adventuring and aerial freedom made it feel unique, even compared to bigger names of the era. The open world structure was one of its biggest achievements. You weren't just traveling from hub to hub. The landscapes felt massive, with valleys, fortresses, and dungeons stitched together in a way that made exploration exciting. Taking to the skies wasn't just a gimmick either. Dogfighting with other dragons mid-air, raining fire down on enemy camps, or simply gliding across the horizon gave it a sense of scale that was way ahead of its time. In a way, it delivered on the fantasy of go anywhere, do anything before open-world RPGs really hit their stride. But it wasn't without problems. The melee combat was stiff and clunky, and the AI often left a lot to be desired. The visuals, while ambitious, pushed hardware to its limits and could be buggy depending on your setup. And despite its open structure, the game didn't always make the best use of its large environments, sometimes leaving areas that felt more empty than alive. Still, for players who experienced it back then, Drakan felt magical. It didn't just offer exploration, it offered freedom in a way few RPGs had managed before. It was bold enough to combine two genres that rarely met, and while it didn't get the recognition it deserved at launch, if its formula had been refined and expanded upon, it could have been a major franchise. Instead, it remains a fascinating relic of a time when developers weren't afraid to swing for the fences. When most RPGs stuck to traditional fantasy, Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura dare to ask, what if Tolkien met the Industrial Revolution? It wasn't just another swords and sorcery adventure. It dropped elves, orcs, and dwarves into a world on the brink of modernity, where steam engines, factories, and firearms clashed with ancient magic. That clash shaped the setting, and it defined how you played. The brilliance of it was how it wove its central theme, technology versus magic, directly into its mechanics. Build a gunslinger relying on gadgets, and you'd find spells misfiring around you, your mere presence disrupting magic. Go full wizard, and technology would sputter in your hands. That tension meant you weren't just picking skills for convenience. You were shaping how the world itself reacted to you. Few RPGs before or since have so boldly tied role-playing choices to their core systems. The open world design was equally ambitious. You weren't on rails. You could wander towns filled with industrial barons, explore remote magical ruins, or get caught up in political struggles between technologists and mystics. The game didn't shy away from moral grayness either. Quests often had multiple solutions, sometimes elegant, sometimes brutal, and the way NPCs responded to your background, race, or abilities added another layer of depth. That said, it wasn't easy to love. The combat was clunky, switching awkwardly between real-time and turn-based modes, and the visuals were dated even for 2001. Bugs plagued the release, and some balance issues meant certain builds were far more effective than others. But underneath the rough edges, Arcanum proved that open-world RPGs didn't need to follow the same tired medieval tropes. It created a setting that felt alien yet familiar, one where progress and tradition clashed in ways that mirrored real-world tensions. 2 decades later, it remains one of the boldest RPG experiments the genre has ever seen.
That's the way to show those bastards.
I remained behind to hide our tracks.
In 1999, most 3D games were still experimenting with blocky polygons and low-res textures. Then came Outcast, a game so ambitious it ditched polygons entirely and built its world with a voxel-based engine that allowed for smoother landscapes, natural curves, and sprawling environments years ahead of their time. It didn't just push technology forward. It delivered an open-world RPG that felt more alive and reactive than almost anything else on the market. You were sent to another dimension to save Earth from impending doom. But what made it special wasn't the setup, it was the world itself. The alien land of Adelpha was a living place, filled with cultures, factions, and NPCs who carried out their own lives. You could talk to almost anyone, barter, gather information, and earn trust by helping villages with problems that weren't always tied to the main quest. That sense of immersion was groundbreaking, making you feel like a visitor in a believable, self-sustaining world. The game's open structure was equally ahead of its time. Instead of funneling you down a single path, it let you tackle objectives in whatever order you chose. The world responded dynamically to your actions. Villages could prosper or struggle, depending on whether you protected them, and your reputation shaped how characters treated you. This level of freedom and consequence isn't that common even now. Of course, its ambition came at a cost. The voxel engine was demanding, requiring powerful PCs to run smoothly, and the controls were clunky even by late 90s standards. The combat often felt stiff, but despite these flaws, Outcast was simply doing things others couldn't. Looking back, it's easy to see how it influenced the open worlds that followed. It emphasized immersion, player choice, and living environments long before those ideas became industry standards. It felt like stepping into the future, a future that many games are still chasing today. Released in 2005, Boiling Point rode to hell tried to do what most games wouldn't dare at the time. Create a massive, open-ended world where factions, vehicles, survival mechanics, and RPG systems all collided into one chaotic sandbox. It was kind of a hybrid of GTA, Far Cry in an RPG form. That was a bold promise, and while the execution was rough, the ambition was undeniable. The game dropped you into a sprawling South American setting searching for your kidnapped daughter. But instead of a linear mission structure, it gave you a huge map filled with towns, jungles, and enemy camps, plus 6 different factions vying for control. You could work with or against any of them, with your reputation dynamically shifting depending on your choices. Few games at the time offered this kind of faction-driven freedom. It made the world feel volatile and unpredictable. What really set it apart was its sheer range of systems. You had to manage hunger, fatigue, and wounds. Vehicles weren't just disposable. You had to refuel, repair, and maintain them. Weapons degraded over time, requiring constant upkeep. These mechanics added layers of immersion, even if they sometimes bordered on tedious. Combined with the dynamic faction system, it created a sense of realism that went far beyond most RPGs of the era. But let's be honest, the game was a mess. It launched with countless bugs, vehicles randomly exploding, NPCs clipping through the ground, missions breaking outright. It was torn apart for being unstable and unpolished, and its reputation suffered as a result. Yet, for all its flaws, it also gained a cult following precisely because of how ambitious it was. Today, Boiling Point feels like a blueprint for games like Far Cry 2 or Stalker. It showed that players craved worlds with factions, survival systems, and consequences. It may not have fully worked, but it was years ahead of its time, and it deserves recognition for daring to aim so high.